Hi, everybody, and welcome to the first episode of this DAOs project that ICDevs is doing. Thank you for joining us, for those of you who are taking your time to either listen or watch this. I have recruited Ethan, who has graciously donated his time to come on and talk about DAOs. We're sort of freewheeling this and trying to figure out how it may work and what we want to do, but let me give a brief intro of why we're here and what sort of prompted this, and then I'll let Ethan introduce himself. We were funded by Dfinity to do a DAOs project in relationship to the bounties and grants that ICDevs has been giving out in the internet computer ecosystem for the last few years. Also does some grants and does some bounties and some RFPs, and we were doing them, and it just sort of made sense to say, hey, let's put our heads together. Can I help you guys maybe answer the question, how do we scale giving out grants and giving out bounties in this Web3 space? Because lots of people have tried it, lots of other Web3 communities have tried it. Some of them have been very successful, some of them have failed miserably and burned through a ton of money. And Dfinity's been very disciplined in how they've done theirs, and I've been a beneficiary of them. I believe Ethan's been a beneficiary of them as well. And so we want to talk about it because if it's helped us, we think it will help others commit to this ecosystem and build awesome, amazing things. So we published the sort of first step of our study or report last week. We looked at a broad range of things about DAOs, specifically focused on bounty and grant programs. And we came up with this very long paper that has, I think currently it has about 104 patterns in it and about 50 or so forms in it. And we'll talk more about later what's a pattern, what's a form. These are things that are out there to define a language. And so this is a language project. We wanted to document these things so that as we're trying to improve them, as we all put our heads together and come up with great ideas, we have a common language. So I thought it would be interesting to go into detail and to actually try, using the language, you actually have to talk, you actually have to use the language. And so I thought that this podcast would be a great way to critique the language, to see if the language works, to see where the language was confusing. Ethan's here to help us talk through some of that, and we're just going to visit about those things specifically. I think each week we'll maybe take a couple of the patterns, maybe one of the forms, talk through them, and then we'll just talk about some DAOs in general. I hope it'll be interesting, and thanks for joining us. Ethan, do you want to take a couple minutes to introduce yourself and tell everybody what you do in this space on the internet computer and how you've contributed so far to the space?
Sure. Yeah. I'm Ethan Sleddy, and so I'm just a freelance dev on the internet computer. Been around for a couple of years. Pretty much my goals have been working on open source libraries and any infrastructure and learning myself and hopefully educating other people. And I have just been fascinated by a lot of these concepts, whether it comes to DAOs or just kind of the Web3 in general, from what I've seen over the years of just like there's a lot of theory and not a lot of implementations of like some of these cool ideas. Things are kind of all over the place. I feel like right now a lot of people see DAOs as essentially like a treasury or like you're just buying in tokens for this kind of company. But how can we get to a place where things are kind of DAO native in a truly like decentralized nature, which the DAOs project is really diving into. You can have like a simple DAO, but these ideas are super complex and they're super new, and we're all kind of figuring out at the same time. So I'm here as a learner and kind of going through all these concepts and really dissecting it and seeing what we can all learn from these things.
Ethan, I do think people should know about daoball a little bit
Mhm.
because it makes sense
That's right.
defining
Yeah.
the DAOs. So can you tell us a little bit about that project and sort of where you're at? And because we'll probably mention it here as we go through some of this stuff, and I think it's a great frame of reference for people to know that you're actually participating in this and trying to contribute to the space at a high level.
That's right. So, about a year or so ago, I had a problem I was looking for a solution to, which is just I personally and people that I know aren't really a part or a participant of DAOs, and some of these concepts are kind of new, foreign, abstract, and how my goal was, can I make something where we can kind of gamify a DAO, like simplify some of these things, have like a kind of an open nature, easy place for people to come, have a fun experience, kind of in a DAO manner, both potentially people learning about like DAOs, but at the same time being able to like experiment with DAOs and hopefully a low stakes manner where it's not feeling like this is an investment you have to put in. So DAO Ball is kind of a gamified experience where this kind of baseball simulation in which you have all the baseball teams are controlled by a DAO, and the league itself is a DAO. And how can we go from this DAO first mentality and be able to do things like reach consensus and show people what governance and participation is like, and how can you do things like contribute to a DAO. Maybe we can inspire things, or maybe we can build some basic libraries or infrastructure to help people. There's a lot of missing components out in the space, especially if you're working with Motoko language on the internet computer. There's just, you need to create a DAO in which you have simple voting mechanisms and execution based on consensus, based on time and majorities and all those different settings. And something like that, everyone will have to make from scratch. Things like this will take a while to build up, but we all got to learn like these concepts and experiment with these things in order to figure out what works and what doesn't.
That's awesome. I always tell developers, when they come and they say, "Hey, I want to learn this language," I'm like, grab something you're passionate about and go build. Right?
Totally.
Like it doesn't matter if you probably will slam into a wall, right? But go try it. That's how you learn, and you learn what tools are out there. I'll add that I'm very partial to Ethan's project. About 16 years ago, I tried to launch something sort of similar. There weren't DAOs back then, and I spent a whole lot of time working on it instead of buying Bitcoin, which I was reading the intro posts on Hacker News, but didn't do anything about it. It was just awesome to see somebody else sort of have a similar idea to say, "Hey, can we organize people and have fun around these concepts and make them fun?" So I'm watching that project with a lot of interest. I'm Austin Fothery. I'm the executive director of ICDevs.org. I also have spent a lot of time working with the Origin Foundation on the Origin protocol. Also do some work with another company called Pan Industrial, where we work with enterprise. This project is a project of ICDevs, and I think it's probably time that we just sort of jump in and start talking about this project. And today I wanted to start at the top. I think typically it would make sense to sort of do like a high level pattern, and I'll explain patterns here in a minute, but a high level pattern and a low level pattern, and then some sort of form that derives from those patterns. But today we're going to look at two high level patterns, because I want to show, first of all, what a pattern is and how other patterns support other patterns. And it just makes sense to sort of start at the top. So for those of you who are listening on audio, I'll try not to depend too much on the video, but I am going to turn on this share here really quick and throw up the website at daos.icdevs.org. And if you go to daos.icdevs.org, you'll see just a standard template that we pulled off the internet to get this published. But you click on the table of, I think the best place to start is sort of the table of contents. And there's really three main parts of the core of this study, which is the generative language, the pattern language, and the form language. I'll talk about what languages are and where they come from. A lot of this is based off of Christopher Alexander's work, who was an architect. He wrote a book, I believe in either the late 60s or early 70s, called A Pattern Language. And there was a companion book to it called The Timeless Way of Building. And Alexander didn't like the way that architecture was going, with star power and everything sort of derived new. he made a case that there are certain patterns that you should follow when you're building things. They work, and humans have developed these patterns over our, tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. If we just throw away the past, you lose a lot of beauty and grace, especially in the building of things and the aesthetics of things. He's not saying don't do anything new. He's saying when you do something new, you should still at least follow these patterns, or at least consider them. And so his first book was called A Pattern Language. It was something like 250 patterns of all the way from nation states and how cities and towns should be situated in a geographical area, all the way down to something as specific as how window seals should be done, and what you should do with the corner of a room. And so it's a fascinating look at a system, and I'd highly recommend, just if you have a library, you may be able to find it nearby. Just going and checking out the book and like just flipping through it is a fascinating experience. Patterns were co-opted by a lot of computer scientists in the 70s and 80s. You do a Google search, you'll find all kinds of computer patterns. These computer patterns were sort of fashioned after Christopher Alexander's ideas and just sort of moved over into the computing space to give developers and system architects a set of patterns that they could use to build good software. They turned into our best practices. It turns out in architecture, the patterns didn't always work the way that Alexander wanted them to. I think they're a fascinating example of organization, and I think it's a really great way to define a language around things that you want inside your systems. But he kept working on it and honing it, and he came up, sort of evolved into this idea of generative languages, and wrote another set of books called The Nature of Order, which is a fascinating look at sort of compressing the building process into a set of, he has 15 transformations that he walks through, and if you read the generative language pattern here, you'll be able to see what those are. There are 15 transformations and sort of a process for creating things and maintaining the whole of what you're building. Humans have been organizing for years, decades and millennium, right? So we have a lot of patterns about how people should be organized that are out there. Some of them are good patterns, some of them are bad patterns. Hopefully we've left a lot of the bad patterns behind. Even those bad patterns probably have things that we can learn from them, and reasons why they were there and what they provided for a society or a functioning organization. DAOs are not going to be that different. They're hopefully going to be vastly more efficient because we're going to have code automating a ton of the administrative overhead and busy work, but a lot of those same patterns are going to be there.
Yeah, if I can jump in, like one of the concepts that I've been fascinated about when going through some of this stuff over the last few years is just kind of what you've been saying, which like I feel like a lot of the mentality of Web3 crypto space and this very like libertarian point of view is just kind of like, let's throw out the book. We're rebuilding society from scratch. DAOs are the future. Nothing else applies. But looking at whether it's like government, like governance, bureaucracies, corporations, all these things are still applying. Yes, there are going to be like differences and different structures and whatnot, but there's so much you can learn from these things. And it's like, okay, you're looking at a book from an architect from the 60s, and you're applying that in the Web3 space. It's very easy to get down this like route of like, oh, here's the new shiny thing, like burn it all down and let's start new. But there's so much you can learn from and so much respect that I have gotten for things like government and other things, institutions that you kind of overlook and that are very complex. And building a DAO is going to be hard, and it's going to take a long time. And there's a reason. We've been doing it for a long time, so like let's look back at some of the things we've done.
Yeah, and I think that one of the most important things to learn from the generative language side of things is that those institutions are important, but they're not perfect. And so as we dive in, I may loop back into the generative language a little bit and talk through some of that at some point, probably not today, but there are lots of great ways to take an institution and make it better through one of these transformations. You look at some of our current institutions that have gotten very large, one of the transformations is levels of scale, right? And so there's a transformation for levels of scale that you can do. If you take a large organization and you say, let's apply this transformation of levels of scale, how does that work? What branches are there? How would it transform that organization? You can end up with, I think, something better and something that operates. And we do that we do that in our code when we're developing. We say, oh, this thing's too big. What can I do to make this better? I'm going to refactor it, right? I'm going to pull this piece out and I'm going to build another transformation of strong boundaries. I'm going to pull this out and put it into its own thing. And I'm going to build a strong boundary between this component and that component, because right now it's a mess and it's not working. And if I isolate this, there's lots of great things that come from isolating it. My code makes more sense. Somebody can grab that and use the same concept somewhere else. And so these transformations and patterns, they cross boundaries of our work and where we're going. So we'll talk about that. And I think as we notice things happening out there in the world and in our DAOs, maybe we ask, hey, this obviously didn't work for this DAO. What transformation could we apply to try to make that better? What would be worth trying? And having 15 of them there's no magic number of 15. I'll throw it up here on the screen in the generative language chapter here. So, the 15 are levels of scale, strong centers, boundaries, alternating repetition, positive space, good shape, local symmetry, deep interlock and ambiguity, contrast, gradients, roughness, echoes, the void, simplicity and inner calm, and not separateness. And then you can go into the book to see how I integrate those over the DAO space and come up with complementary transformations. It would be interesting at some point to take those, and if we see a problem area, grab that problem area and try to apply one of those transformations and potentially fix it. Today I wanted to start with resource optimization in our pattern language. If you click on the table of the actual pattern language top layer and go down and go all the way to the bottom, you'll see that there's these 6 very intricate pictures, and I'll click on one here and zoom in on it. At the bottom, you have a pattern, and then what these pictures do is they show you all of the other patterns that support that pattern. So in this instance, I have resource development, and it's supported by a number of things, including mentorship programs, cross-functional teams, and infrastructure. And there's a lot more. I'm not going to go into all of them because we're about to do that for resource optimization. The pattern that I chose at the top level was resource optimization, and then these six items support it. The structure of a pattern is, and I'll click on it here, you typically have some kind of picture, and these, you'll have to forgive these pictures. A lot of them are very bluntly, they were generated by AI, and because I was in a hurry, and I would love to recruit a designer who wants to participate in this project to go through and redo these. If you would like to do that, reach out and we can figure out a way to try to make that happen. Typically you have an image that sort of shows you what the pattern looks like, even in kind of an abstract way. Then you define a context. What is the context of this pattern? And that context leads to a specific problem that the pattern solves. We discuss the forces of the pattern. What are the main forces pushing in on this pattern that we need to consider? What's the solution that the pattern provides? And then there's sort of a therefore, right? We say, therefore, do this. And then each pattern is either supported by a number of other patterns or supports a number of other patterns. So lower level patterns will have things at the top and bottom for things that they support, and then things that they are supported by. I'm going to open up this resource optimization image here. We'll see that there are 6 items that support resource optimization. So what do I mean by a resource optimization, and why did I put it at the top? There's obvious resources, like tokens in a DAO, right? Your treasury. What can you spend? What assets do you have? But there's also people, There's also attention. There are a number of things that you have as resources of your DAO to get things done. Kevin Owaki at Gitcoin is known for saying it's all coordination, right? It really is. And a lot of it is coordinating your resources and making sure that you're not wasting them, that you're taking advantage of them, and utilizing those is how we get things done. So that's why we picked resource optimization at the top. Ethan, as you sort of read through resource optimization, were there any thoughts or questions that you had on this particular pattern?
I just think in general, when I was going through this, which I recommend everyone like going through, or at least some of these top level ones, like breaking this down into your forces section really speaks to me of just like, this is a different mindset. There's a lot of overlap. If you're thinking about governance or like corporate or whatever, how do you make a decision, or how do you optimize resources? It's a different equation versus this. It just feels like, as you say, there are forces, kind of this balancing between like, okay, with your decentralization, like you're gonna diffuse your power, but coordination can become tougher because it's kind of like spread out. Or like with your transparency, like there isn't an objective, like this is the right answer. It's kind of looking at like different situations have different strengths of forces and trade-offs they can make. This is kind of breaking down what things to look at and potential solutions to do it. I do have a quick question, maybe taking a little bit of a step back of just like, how exactly do you come up with these kind of things? Like what resources were you using, or how do you come up with like, here are the forces, here are the solutions for this project?
Yeah, I guess I'll say this about this project. These ideas that are presented here, especially things like in the forces, these are really just conjectures I came up with, right? And I certainly tried to validate them, but you can tell by the amount of content that this is really a huge lift. And so I wouldn't take anything written here as sort of gospel. It should be vetted by the community. It should be questioned and critiqued and those kinds of things. I think this is maybe like my fifth really systematic and large pattern language that I've done. So you sort of get good at it eventually. And as we sort of experiment with new tools, it's actually fascinating, right? Now that we have these AIs and LLMs. In the past, you just kind of sit there and think about these things and wonder about them and plan them out and write them down. But unless you had a sounding board, you had no way to sort of say, does this make any sense whatsoever?
Yeah.
And so it's actually really interesting to like sit there and come up with something and say, hey, here's my pattern. These are the forces, these are the issues that people have. These are the problems that people have. Can you help me distill these down into, a manageable list that people will understand? A lot of this process was that. It was, hey, let me organize all my thoughts and get all of the context together. And then, okay, hey, can you help me organize these? And the LLMs have been used a couple different ones for different pieces. They're amazing, right? And of course, you read it and you check the work and you're like, does that make sense? And you're like, oh, that does make sense, or that one doesn't make sense. And you throw that one out. Clearly, you misunderstood something or whatever, right? I was able to get this one done a lot faster because I had those tools than ones that I've done in the past. But you have to define the context for the AI, or it just spits out, foreign language basically.
Yeah, totally.
So
Yeah, I've done very similar stuff myself, whether it comes with design and brainstorming ideas, just throwing things out there. And it's not going to give you the answers, but it can really get the conversation going and get you really thinking about different things. And I think with this is great because it's like, with some of these concepts, there is no like objective answer. These are guidelines. These are things to observe and to learn from and build up. Because this is, from what I understand, not like it's not like set in stone. It's more of a living kind of document that can evolve.
Yeah, one thing that you'll see in Alexander's patterns that I haven't done here, I think maybe in a couple patterns I actually went and did a bit more, went into a bit more depth. So I would say these are incomplete because they're missing a very key piece, which is either use cases or real world examples of these things. And so what really needs to happen for each of these is somebody going in and saying, let's actually show this in the real world, right? So resource optimization. Who's done a good job at resource optimization, right? Like the EF has their model of doing resource allocation and optimization, ideas of subtraction and things like that they rely on. Dfinity has their way that they've sort of done it and their reasons and the successes that have come out of those. And so I think each of these has an opportunity for someone to step up and try to go in and procure those, put them in. And that just gives even more weight to the legitimacy of the pattern. There's plenty of opportunity for that as well. So from there, from resource optimization, I guess I'll just sort of summarize it and say, that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to get a bunch of people together, some of who are themselves resources and some of who have resources, and have them apply their attention and effort, which are also resources, into a goal or an objective or a system, and have that thing be a living, thriving thing. As you build these patterns, what you're looking for is a way for those to cascade from the very highest down to like the lowest detail. What's a low detail item? If I look at this item and I go way up to the top, you'll see things like annual reports, right? So an annual report is a thing that someone can do in a DAO to sort of summarize the year and say, here's what the DAO did. It's a chance to sort of celebrate it and check in and evaluate and those kinds of things. So we're gonna create this hierarchy from very high down to down low. And if you agree that resource optimization is at the top, maybe you don't, but in this pattern language it does. It's supported by these 6 other things, which are community involvement, right? Each DAO has a community and they need to be involved for the DAO to exist. There's impact measurement. What is your DAO doing? Especially in the grant and bounty space, you have to be able to measure how you've organized those resources and did they have impact. There's resource development, which ends up being mostly about people and the people in your DAO and preparing them to take over roles and preparing them to participate in the DAO and support each other and make sure that you have consistency. There's incentive alignment. How do you get everybody on the same page about what you're actually trying to accomplish? From that descends a lot of token things and incentivization. You have risk management. With every DAO there, you have a risk. You actually have treasury risk. How am I managing my treasury? Do we vote 2/3 or do we vote 50%? Or do we just have a 2 out of 3 multi-sig that 3 of the founders have in keys under their beds? You got to make those decisions and manage all of that risk. And then there's effective action. And the second thing I wanted to talk about today was effective action. And so what's nice is when you're reviewing this on the web, you can just click effective action and it will take you to the effective action pattern. Ethan, anything else you want to say about resource optimization before we jump into effective action?
No, let's dive right in.
Cool. So effective action, it supports resource optimization. What effective action is this pattern that says our DAO has to be able to get things done. And I think DAOs have a real problem with this, right? Sometimes they can get things done, but they're not the right things. If we take some examples from, I'll try to be vague about this, right? But if you're thinking about doing a DAO on the internet computer, you need to realize that it is very, very hard for your DAO to get a bank account. And if your DAO doesn't have a bank account, you can't pay people to work for your DAO. So you are a highly ineffective DAO until you figure out a way to get a bank account. You can try to pay in crypto, but you'll find very quickly that not everyone wants to work for crypto. Not everyone wants to manage the currency risk of getting paid in crypto. And so you're going to have to solve that problem. Solving that problem makes you much more effective in the actions that you take, because you can actually pay people in a way that they want to get paid, in a way that's accountable to the taxing authorities and the local jurisdictions. There are other areas of effective action, like how do you decide what to do with your funds? Is everybody going to vote on every single item? Or are you going to authorize a council? Or are you going to have some hybrid system where you're going to say, okay, we're going to authorize a marketing council. We're going to put 3 people on that we trust to market our DAO. Out of those 3 people, 2 of them have to agree to spend money, right? There's sort of, again, it goes back to like levels of scale. There's different levels of scale that you can do to improve how effective your organization can be. The problem with, and I've seen this on NNS DAOs, people trying to get the treasury to approve money to give to someone to do marketing, is that 90% of the people in your DAO just don't know anything about they don't know anything about marketing.
Yeah.
Liquid democracy is an interesting solution to that, which we can talk about more.
Yeah, I agree with I feel like in the IC space, especially, that's where I'm hanging out most of, whether it's NNS or SNS or any sort of DAO. I feel like there are 2 levels. There's the like creators, runners, whether it's Dfinity or whoever is the developers, and then just kind of everyone else. And there isn't much in between. And it's just like, well, do you want to get things done? But you have this conflict of people feel like it's not decentralized in order to get things through, or you kind of like have everyone else who's like a token holder who's not involved in this project. Are they even voting? Do they know what they're talking about? So there's definitely this like lack of this concept. And like, so for example, like with, if there's a bug in the NNS, like what's going to happen right now, which is some people argue is not very decentralized, is like Affinity is just going to push through a bug versus, like there are different organizations like CodeGov or whatnot to be able to validate and do these things. That's kind of like an institution or some level in between where you have the knowledge, but you have some more of a speed, but it's still somewhat decentralized. This is definitely a thing that the IC can learn from.
You want effective action, right? So the fact that Dfinity has put that in place, if somebody reports to them a mission critical bug that could drain people's wallets, you want them to get that fixed as fast as possible, but you want to make sure that they do it in a careful way and in a systematic way. And so they've done a really good job of defining that process and saying, look, we will, this is our normal process. If there is an emergency, we're going to follow this process. It's clear, right? You're not breaking confidence by executing those because you've been upfront about how that will work. The other thing that sort of falls out of effective action that's really interesting for DAOs, it's one of the strongest cases for DAOs, is that you can make the code do things automatically, right? And so we'll talk about this in some future patterns. Say you do have a marketing council, right? And that's going to spend money for marketing, and they're allocated a budget, and there's 3 people on that. Well, what happens if Betty and Joe decide they don't like the DAO and they just bolt, right? They don't show up to meetings, they don't vote on anything, and you've got some poor guy sitting there and then who still believes in the DAO, who's still there, who believes in it, and he's on the council, but he can't do anything because these other 2 have run off and he can't get any transfers through. You can build code to fix that, right? You can and we'll look at doing this, and it's the form that we'll talk about today is going to help with this, I think. You can build dead man switches, right? If you don't vote on a certain number of things, you get booted from the DAO, and there's a pool of people who are willing to serve and that the DAO has pre-approved to serve, and the DAO can randomly select one of those to take action in the absence of someone else until you get back to another situation where you want to re-vote for the council, right? So that's an effective action that your code can take that takes administrative burden off of people in the DAO and moves it into the code layer, right? And this is where I think DAOs can really gain a ton of advantage over traditional organizations, because you can think through these things and you can build them. Now, we're not good at pre-guessing what these situations are, so I think we need some history of DAOs working and a flexible framework so that as situations like that come up and we come up with a good solution, we're able to sort of fold those in and share them across DAOs. I think that's really a super powerful use of this effective action pattern, is what situations can we avoid through code where people have to make an additional decision.
Right. Yeah, not just actually executing themselves, but yeah, some other organization being able to, oh, that's a good idea, and be able to replicate that code in for their organization, and then we kind of like evolve quickly without that human learning curve or whatever your normal institutions would have to overcome.
Let's just take a quick look here at what supports effective action. Some interesting patterns. And as we go through this series, we're going to grab these sort of randomly and talk about them, but I think it's interesting to just name them as we go through here, right? So effective action is supported by other patterns. So we've got credible neutrality, which means your mechanism is fair and impartial. That makes it very effective. Nothing will subvert your DAO's ability to get something done than a political fight breaking out at a critical decision point. Right? So having as many things that you can predetermine and have happen, you can always fix a situation later, but having a predetermined pathway through some of this in code that makes it go is important. Legitimacy, your DAO needs to have legitimacy. Whoever you have given the authority to take action needs to have legitimacy, or again, fights will break out. Cross-functional teams, this starts to get into some sort of a meta level here where a lot of DAOs, and maybe I can throw this over to you in the daoball space. I'm guessing right now you don't have a very good cross-functional team on daoball.
No.
When you're a solo developer, I mean, you're trying to do everything, and you end up. I often feel like I'm like having to concentrate on all these other things, like marketing and tweeting, and it makes me a worse programmer, right?
Yeah.
And so being able to have teams where you have the people who are good at things doing things is really important and makes you more effective, like almost by definition.
Yeah, definitely because I struggle with this too, and it's not just having to do everything, and since my expertise isn't in that, not as good, and it's going to take me that much longer than someone else who does that expertise. So being able to rely on functional cross teams would be super helpful.
Next pattern is democratic participation initiatives. These are just ways to make things more democratic and incentivize people to participate, which is a really hard thing to do in your DAO. If your DAO requires a 20% threshold and only 15% of the people are participating, you have a really serious effective action problem. You see this currently in NNS proposals where if you're trying to get a treasury thing through, I don't think followings work for treasury proposals. So you got to wait the full 4 days. Like it may still pass because you'll get past quorum, but if you don't hit 66% approval, you just got to sit and wait for the thing to finish and finalize. If you have effective action and you have broad participation and you get to 66%, you may be able to get your tokens in an hour if you have a good notification mechanism and those kinds of things. Decentralized decision making helps with effective action as well. It helps with legitimacy also. And then scalable decision making. Where are you going to make your decisions? And that'll be an interesting one to talk about, because some of the most successful DAOs that I've seen, they don't vote on everything. They don't vote until it gets really serious, and they sort of operate off of general consensus and Slack emojis and things like that before they ever get to actually having to vote on things. So anyway, interesting discussions to have on all those patterns as we continue to go through. Anything else on effective action that's worth talking about?
I don't think so.
I wanted to talk about a form on each episode as well. So if you go to the form language, I'll give a high level summary here. Forms are broken down currently into a few different categories. First of all, smart contracts, or like mechanisms in smart contracts, activities that a DAO does, institutions that a DAO has inside of it, and then support software that a DAO can use to support itself, and then roles that a DAO can give out. The first form that I wanted to talk about today was this is a smart contract, and it's the role, group, and permission tool. This is what sort of fell out of our research is we need this built for the internet computer, and it needs to be a pluggable module and an ICRC standard that people can use in their DAOs very easily. Instead of having to go build that into the SNS and sort of having to wait for the Dfinity team to prioritize it and then build it, the goal for us in this project is to build one that you can install as a DApp canister in your SNS, and then you get all of these features. And you can then, in your other smart contracts, you can give rights to roles instead of individual people. So you could say, hey, anyone from this list can use this tool. Anybody from this list can vote. Anybody from this list can take up to 10 ICP from this account once a month, right? Management of those things then become very clear, and reporting on those things become very clear, because you can name those things, you can give them metadata, you can create a role explorer for your DAO where people can go in and see what the different roles are, who's in those roles, what kind of permissions have been given to those roles. From there, we hope that we can use some of the cool features of the IC, like verifiable credentials or subnet signatures and those kinds of things, to issue credentials that you can take out of the IC and into other services and prove that you have that role to other services or even other smart contracts on the IC. So that should be coming out soon. We reserved ICRC 75 as the standard. It has a lot of crossover because we need that same functionality over on the events utility working group. We also need it inside of DAOs. It's an interesting piece of software that sort of has some crossover. So hopefully we'll have a demo of that soon and some use cases. I guess I've sort of rambled on a bit about it. Ethan, does that make sense to you? And do you see a place where you might be able to utilize that kind of tool in smart contracts?
Yeah. So I just want to comment first, just from like gut reactions, or just kind of like what I see here, which I totally agree with, like all this stuff versus kind of like what I see, or the kind of feeling out there of like this whole like role group permission type of thing kind of feels like opposite of what like a lot of like crypto stuff has been, where it's like this is a permissionless system, right? It's just like you got tokens and people are doing stuff, which like there's nothing like wrong with that. Like there are certain places and things to do with tokens or having permissionless systems, but you can't throw out the whole book kind of thing. And like there are like you need to have people who are putting in the work and like are delegated things, instead of just like have all these thousands of people maybe come up with something, or do some action. I don't know if you mentioned in your intros, like this DAOs project, and like you were just talking about, it's not just like here are all the like abstract ideas and things to learn from, but it's like, okay, let's lay it all out, and how do we actually start getting this stuff going? And it's not just, oh, let's build our own DAO with this stuff. It's like, in order for these things to really work and for people to utilize, you gotta make standards and reach a consensus on, okay, here's this, like we need roles, groups, and permissions, but what does that actually mean, between all these different DAOs and whatnot? Like, what's the commonality? Like what can people utilize? How can we be flexible or inflexible enough to work in certain situations, which I think is really cool. There are all these ideas out there, and I wish we could just like snap our fingers and just be like, let's try this out, let's get it going. But like, there's so much infrastructure work that needs to be put in place in Web3 in general, but like IC is like relatively new compared to like some other existing crypto spaces, and we kind of need to build a lot of this stuff from scratch. And these basic things we may take for granted in other systems are just, what is a role, what is a group? We're not building an app. We're just kind of like all coming to kind of an agreement on these foundational pieces that once we stack them all together, then we have these super powerful tools, but is a little slower and it's hard to do, right? And it's going to take a long time.
Yeah, if we build enough Lego bricks, then it's a lot easier to build a little Lego castle if you have the bricks than if you've got to carve the thing out of clay yourself, right?
Right.
So that's what we're hopefully doing. And as you look across this form language, the number of things in this form language that need this tool, the role rotator needs it, the fund distributor potentially needs it, the voting booth contract needs it, prioritization votes contract needs it. There's just a ton of these forms need that contract sort of as at the base of what they need, right? It's like a role rotator contract takes these roles and it says this list of people are available for this role and we need 2 of them at a time or 3 of them at a time. Well, every 3 months rotate these out and rotate 3 random new ones in, right? If you have this ICRC 75 contract to build on top of, the contract becomes this small to write, right? Like it becomes super easy to write. You're writing like 10 lines of code,
Right.
because you're resting on top of a Lego block that has 2,000 lines of code in it. So
Right.
that's definitely the goal here. All right, that's patterns and forms for this episode. The next thing we wanted to talk about was just sort of some big questions. So Ethan, I'll give you an opportunity to ask a big question and we can just talk about it here for a minute.
Well, I think just to kind of like recap on all this, and something that I've been doing is just like what exactly is a DAO? Is there like a DAO? Like, is there like, is there the one DAO that is like perfect, or is a spectrum, or how would you define like what a DAO really is?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a huge garden of different kinds of DAOs. And I think it's going to depend on what your mission and purpose is. What are you incentivized towards, and what are you trying to accomplish, right? The DAO that runs the NNS is going to be just vastly different than the DAO that they're trying to automate co-ownership of cars, right? Like those are just 2 wildly different purposes. And I would imagine that the structure of the DAO, the type of applications you're going to need in your DAO stack, are going to be wildly different for those 2 kinds of DAOs. I don't think that a one-size-fits-all DAO infrastructure is going to work. To Dfinity's credit, the SNS, which started that way, they very quickly got to a point where you can add your own DApp canisters to it, right? And so now with the SNS, if you have one of those DAOs and you want to provide some functionality that is not built into the SNS, you can just install a canister that has that functionality, give that canister sort of the same rights as your DAO. So I think that's a great advancement for the SNS, and as they move that code more to an open platform where you can sort of form baby SNSs without having to do the whole fundraising thing, I think that's just going to give us a ton more ability to mess around and test out that gradient of different things. What about you? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I agree with it. I'll just say the way I've been really approaching DAOs is I don't think of DAOs as a smart contract. Like, the smart contract is an implementation of a DAO, and a lot of the like DAOs I see out there, which it's a hard problem to solve. And we're going to get there eventually, and they're in their infancy right now. I think from conversations we've had earlier, that was insightful, that we've had was just kind of, you kind of look at a DAO more like an institution. And it depends really on what exactly your goal is, but I feel like in general, a DAO is the entity, and some people can drop off, some people can come on. It's just kind of like its own living thing that's controlling something versus, I think a lot of times we see right now, it's just like there's a smart contract where there's the owners and runners of it, and they have community kind of pushback or gating type of thing on being able to do something versus something that's a little more self-sustainable and optimizing for these resources or whatever, but do it in a way where you're not reliant on the true decentralization, not reliant on one party to be able to do something and guide everything. You kind of have all these, what this DAO project is, having all these patterns in place and all these things to where, like, again, take a long time to really get down, but whatever like scenario you're in or whatever people are doing, it's able to kind of like adapt and form and not be reliant on just that single party and be able to grow and evolve and split and reform and that kind of thing. DAO for me is more of an abstract idea of, can you get a bunch of people together and be productive and accomplish a goal versus some sort of like, funding mechanism and community gating.
Yeah, one of the papers that we used in the study was a white paper. I think it's called Metal X project, and it's these lawyers. I think at least one of them's a lawyer, and that paper was a lot about sort of cybernetic organizations, right? So DAOs becoming these cybernetic organizations that are half code and half people, because you can't get away from the people. There may be some DAOs, and we could do this experiment. Like there may be some DAOs that are purely on chain and are just code, and you're only voting on things that ever affect on chain, maybe. But I think that would be like the exception rather than the rule. And almost all of them intersect the real world. And if they don't intersect the real world, it's almost like, well, what are we doing? Like if this is not having an actual effect out in the real world, what are we doing here? So I like that idea of sort of a cybernetic organization that's not just people, it's people plus code, right?
Right.
Well, so to sum up, we either ask what you're working on or what should people know about. So Ethan, I'll ask you, what are you working on, or what should people know about out in the internet computer ecosystem?
Yeah, so daoball, if you want to check it out, we're on Twitter, daoball.xyz, or go daoball.xyz in your browser and join our open chat and whatnot. Just been playing around with that. I'm at the final parts of my grant from Dfinity. Trying to get a beta out there, get out in the wild, see what works, what doesn't, start evolving what it is, putting out libraries, and continuing to build some of these foundational infrastructure pieces and really push the open source and get everyone on a similar train, and have, I really want a place where like people are starting to think, let's work together. Let's not build like an app and put an app out there, but rather like, how can we build something that is interconnected and that brings a lot of utility. Daoball was where I'm trying to experiment with some of these things. I'm gonna fail at some things, but we'll get somewhere. What are you working on?
Awesome. Last couple of weeks, a lot of my focus has been on this event utility working group and getting our. We sort of reached the phase where we need to do it. We have ICRC 72, which is the base standard, and Ethan's been working on that working group with me. But we have our base standard, and now we're sort of in the implementation phase. So we're gonna go out and try to build like a minimum viable event utility, and a couple different people are building those. What I've learned doing ICRC 7 and 37 and 4, I've worked on a number of them now, until you actually implement them, you probably haven't written a very good standard. Because as soon as you start implementing, you go, oh God, we forgot this, and this is really hard to do in this standard. And The best time to solve those problems is before you release the standard and before people start building tools on top of your standard. So there's a lot of that. And I just like to sort of pitch that people should go check out Open Internet Summer that Seb is doing. He's just put a ton of work into it. I know they had some folks in Portugal for a couple of weeks. I really wanted to go, and my trip just didn't quite happen. He's training a lot of new developers. They're looking at this idea of personal wallet and web canisters. I think he's going to have a white paper coming out soon on that. I just think it's a great opportunity. There's a ton of material there if you want to learn to develop for the internet computer. Their Motoko Bootcamp is all linked from that site, and you can sort of go do that self-paced if you want, or join a cohort to go through it. So definitely go check out Open Internet Summer, and I think they're probably going to have some sort of demo day or something like that coming up soon that I hope everybody will be able to check out and see what people have been working on over the last month.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I'll just say, like, yeah, the Seb, who's running the Internet Summer, I think he's got some pretty cool ideas on stuff that it'll be hard to do, but like feels a lot more Web3 IC native approach of user-based canisters and interconnecting things versus having your classic, here's an app I'm going to put up and I'm going to have users come to it. So yeah, I would recommend checking that out as well.
Awesome. Well, thanks for everybody who waded through this. Thanks everybody for joining, and we'll try to do this again soon and explore the next set of patterns. So